When kale plants flower, they go full circle. Besides looking majestic, when your kale or collard greens put out yellow spires around your garden, they still are very much useful in the kitchen. I happen to prize the inflorescence of kale as a delicacy. But before we get to flowering, we must go back to how my plants got to this stage, when they were but fragile seedlings. I had grown red Russian kale in an experimental cold frame over the winter. I sold them thickly, treating them as baby leaf salad. I had also transplanted a few of them to another spot to grow with the traditional space devoted to kale. It had suffered transplant shock, but my hope was that it would recover and produce normal-sized leaves. A couple weeks later, as spring strengthened its hold, the transplanted kales showed signs of resilience. New fresh leaves appeared over the shriveled ones. I knew the roots were probably doing their job, searching for nourishment, quickly establishing a network underground. On the other side, the mini kale grew vibrantly, despite having to eke out an existence, competing tooth and nail with their neighbors. This was the perfect stage to start harvesting leaves for salad. Since the plants had weathered the winter, they were most likely to flower soon. The kale has grown and is flowering, so it's already bolting. That means I should harvest it. I think it's still tender enough to be eaten, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to harvest it as a cut and come again green and see what happens. Usually kale, once it starts flowering, it's not the best plant to regenerate, but we'll see what happens. At least that was my preconceived notion before I actually tried to grow it in this manner. For sure, before it flowered, baby kale grown like this is supremely tender, and in my opinion, much better suited to be eaten raw in salads. But as it is flowering, it is still delicious, still better than old, tough leaves in grocery stores. I'm cutting it right to the middle of the plant, and one of the things I appreciated the most about this technique of growing them densely is that actually they suppressed all the weeds. Therefore, I didn't have to do much weeding actually. So this is a great cycle to do in late winter or even growing through winter microgreens. They're still very tender. Even the stalks with the flowers. Until some years ago, you could never find baby kale on store shelves, and eating them at this stage was the privileged secret of renegade home gardeners that didn't really follow conventions, or California's Napa Valley gastronomic elite, who opened up America's eyes to the wonders of arugula and mixed greens, including baby kale. But there is no reason for these leaves to be restricted knowledge. They can and should be enjoyed by all. They are extremely nutritious, containing antioxidants and phytochemicals that modern science has found to even prevent and fight cancer. Growing them is easy, and by harvesting them early as baby leaves and then as cut and come again salad, you get to enjoy your produce quicker and more constantly. This kale here, I'm going to cook it as farofa, which is a Brazilian dish. But I'm gonna do it with a twist, and for that I'll need another homegrown ingredient. I don't think Brazilians usually use this, but you know, I'm Brazilian, I'm using it, so. Leek was my second star ingredient. These were still remaining stalks that ventured winter and had since fattened up into nice specimens. Some were showing early signs of flowering, so I had to harvest the ones I wanted to eat soon, before flower stalks developed, making leeks tough and inedible. I would certainly let a few of them flower, as I usually do to collect the seed. I would also do that with a couple of kale plants. By allowing a few plants to flower and set seed, you can save your own seed and become 100% kale independent. Coming up in the next block, I share with you a flavor-packed Brazilian dish with my harvest. You really don't want to miss this one, right after this commercial. If you enjoyed the videos and would like to support the channel, you can purchase an original painting or drawing in my Etsy shop, or become a patron in my Patreon. I went inside with treasures from the garden, ready to cook up some farofa. Kale and leek would be the protagonists for this dish. There is nothing quite as satisfying as coming up with recipes to use whatever you have at hand, especially if you grew it yourself. Farofa is a traditional Brazilian side dish, usually found at any family gathering. The version I was making would be a little bit less orthodox, however, since I do like to innovate. After washing the leek well, I cut it into thin slices. I had some onions that were sprouting, so I took one of them and chopped it, including the sprouting stem. In my opinion, farofa tastes better whenever onion is used heavily for flavoring. Summer invites new fireflies, lighting in flickers the bosom of night. Children in white stare at the sky, running in circles, their dreams are denied. I dropped the chopped onions and leek into a skillet and proceeded in rinsing the kale. I then roughly chopped the kale, flower stalks and all, and reserved. Waiting for change, waiting for change. Autumn brings forth old lullabies. I added some olive oil and salt to the skillet, as well as turmeric powder and ground black pepper, sauteing everything until golden brown. Echoes can't hide where truth resides, marking the tireless passage of time. All their tears have run dry, all their fears realized, all their hopes sag inside, waiting for change. I then added the chopped kale and stirred until it wilted. Now came the backbone of the dish, the ingredient that makes farofa be farofa, toasted manioc flour. Manioc flour is not something you can find just anywhere. It is usually only sold in Brazilian markets or some international markets. It is made from yuca, but it should not be confused with tapioca. Tapioca or manioc starch is something very different. Manioc flour is called gari in Africa, but I prefer to source mine from Brazil because in my experience, gari is a bit more sour and rougher in texture, since it is usually intended to be cooked with a liquid and not eaten dry as the Brazilian manioc flour is. After adding enough manioc flour to get a crumbly consistency, I turned off the heat and drizzled some extra virgin olive oil to finish. I think farofa tastes better when accompanied by beans and rice. This is the typical Brazilian diet. With all modesty, this is amazing. I know I'm biased to say this because I made the dish and because I'm Brazilian, but farofa with beans, it's heaven. Now, I've heard that some Americans don't, when they try farofa, they might not appreciate it, and I've heard that they complain that it has a sandy texture. But that's because they try the regular, traditional farofa. That's just the manioc flour that's fried over butter, and it retains a very dry texture, and people usually eat it with beans and meat. But this way, by using the kale and by letting it be a little bit moister, it's something else. And to tell you the truth, the leek, I'm not aware if people use this in Brazil, maybe in high cuisine, but it's not traditional at all. And it makes a huge difference. Onions and garlic are amazing, and that's the basis of Brazilian seasoning. But Adding the leek, man, such a subtle, delicious onion flavor. And then the kale. And that's the other thing. If you do it with non-homegrown produce, especially the kale, it's not going to taste like this. It's just not. Because homegrown kale actually has flavor. And it's tender. Unless you buy it from a farmer's market that just picked it right there, you're never going to be able to replicate this. So grow it at home. Get some manioc flour. It's worth it. All in all, life doesn't have to be complicated. Food doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes the simplest things of life are the most satisfying. A simple, honest dish is satisfying both to the palate and to the soul. Nature provides us with the best. All we need to do is recognize it. As for my other kale patch, it overcame its initial hurdles and flourished into beautiful plants. And the cut and come again patch provided me with many more meals. More than I had expected. I would class this as a huge success.